Hi, guys, it's Professor Schlegel. I promised that I would send you the rest of the French Revolution PowerPoint. So, this PowerPoint is really, really long. So, we have to go down to the part about the French Revolution. We're going to scroll all the way down to, I think we'll start with slide 96. I know we talked about some of this in class. To be honest, I'm not sure how much of the National Assembly we discussed. So, I'm going to start with the National Assembly. And you can just fast forward this if you already have these notes. So, if you recall, the National Assembly was born out of the tennis court oath, which was something that occurred, an event that occurred after the Estates General attempted to meet for the first time in many, many years in 1789. Members of the Third Estate were really frustrated because the First and Second Estate could not agree to fair voting practices. So they broke away and they decided that they were going to form a new government for France. They called themselves the National Assembly, and they said that they were going to basically revoke the current way of doing things in France, not necessarily remove the king from office, but just find a more equitable distribution of power within the government. Louis, of course, Louis XVI did not like this, so he locked them out of their meeting hall. They found a quick remedy, though. They located a large room nearby. It was a tennis court. And they met there. In that tennis court, they took an oath to continue to meet until they had written a new constitution for France. Now, while all of this was happening at Versailles, the peasants in France were really struggling. 1788 and 89 showed very poor harvests for the country, and prices were soaring. There was an extreme grain shortage, which was a major problem because bread was a major staple of the French diet. So a lot of peasants were literally starving. Prices were high, unemployment rose, and currency was devalued. People were uprooted from home searching for work, and they were really looking to their government to offer some relief, which of course it did not. Now, all of this came to a boiling point in July of 1789 when angry peasants decided that they were going to take matters into their own hands. I'm skipping forward to slide 100 right now. On July 14, 1789, some angry Parisians decided that they were going to attack a prison, which also functioned as a federal arsenal. They really just wanted to seize the weapons inside the prison. But in the process, they ended up starting a full-on riot. They went to the doors of the Bastille, which was a prison I think I told you in class, where the king was in the habit of incarcerating political prisoners, basically people who criticized him or disagreed with him. He would often put them in prison, sometimes without even a trial, and keep them there for years at a time. So in July of 1789, it just so happened that the prison was almost empty. But the governor, the man in charge of the prison, and a number of soldiers were in residence at that time. So this angry mob approached the prison, and they demanded that the governor surrender, which of course he did not. A number of his soldiers fired into the crowd. They killed quite a few members of the crowd, about 98 civilians. And then the civilians converged upon the prison and killed 6 soldiers, the governor, and a few other officials. They chopped off their heads, put them on spears, and paraded them through the city of Paris. Now, this event has come to symbolize the beginning of the French Revolution. It's symbolic for a number of reasons. One, because the peasants took matters into their own hands. They adopted a mob mentality, which of course gave them tremendous power. They had a common enemy, and they acted with a lot of decisive force. Now, the other reason that this is largely significant is because it unleashed sort of a cavalcade of violence against members of the aristocracy in France. After the storming of the Bastille, members of the peasant class began attacking en masse members of the aristocracy. Local groups of peasants would, storm or violently approach the house or castle of a local lord, pull him out of bed, murder him, murder his family, burn the castle down. So there was this sort of onslaught of violence from the peasant class against the aristocracy. And because of this, a lot of members of the aristocracy fled France during this time, during the summer of 1789. Now, this might not sound like it's important, but it will come into play later on. So just kind of put that in the back of your brain for right now. So let's talk about the National Assembly, and then we're going to come back to this mob mentality. So let's go to slide 97. What did the National Assembly really want to do for France? How did it plan to improve life? Well, they decided that they were going to proclaim that all male citizens would be equal before the law. But of course, by this, we only really mean white men who own property or can pay a voting tax. They wanted to limit the power of the monarchy, and they wanted to have some kind of legislative assembly. So they weren't going for a democracy, they were really going for some kind of constitutional monarchy. They also wanted to get rid of all those old special privileges that the nobility enjoyed, and they wanted to call an end to all vestiges of that old feudal system that were so unfair to the peasant class. They wanted to abolish labor guilds and trade unions, and this is really interesting because most of the National Assembly, all of the National Assembly were members of the Third Estate. The majority of the Third Estate was comprised of skilled laborers and peasants. A small portion of the Third Estate was made up of the wealthy bourgeoisie. These were the people who owned the businesses where tradesmen worked. So clearly, by abolishing trade guilds and labor unions, you can see the voice of that wealthy bourgeoisie at work, and it's not taking into consideration the needs of the skilled laborers and the peasants. So this is going to come back to haunt them later on. They declared freedom of religion. They also took over and sold church lands. So this sounds like it's going to sort of maybe help the peasants, maybe not. Couple problems with the National Assembly. Actually, I'm going to back up a little bit here. First of all, the system of voting that they set up didn't really help the peasants at all because you had to be able to pay a voting tax, which most of the peasantry could not. The sale of church lands was supposed to provide for a more equitable distribution of lands, and of course that was unsuccessful as well because although the church lands were sold at a bargain rate, members of the peasant class could not afford to buy them. This means that, once again, you have the wealthy ruling. It's not the old aristocracy, but now it's the wealthy bourgeoisie. Those are the people who can afford to pay the poll tax, and those are the people who can afford to buy the church lands. Then with the abolition of guilds and trade unions, you have all hopes of the peasantry sort of dashed to the wind that things will ever get better for them economically. So right after the National Assembly forms, it sort of digs itself into a ditch almost immediately because it doesn't address the needs of the poorest and largest segment of the population. So let's take a look at a timeline. July 14th, the Bastille is stormed. Only a few weeks later, on the night of August 4th, a pretty significant meeting occurs. The king, after the storming of the Bastille and the murder of all these different members of the noble class, gets really nervous. So he calls together whatever noblemen and members of the clergy he can find, and he begs them to come with him to a meeting of the National Assembly. He tries to reason with them, basically say, look, they're going to kill us if we don't meet their demands. So let's go to one of their meetings, let's try to negotiate with them, and see if we can appease them in some way. And that's me. I didn't turn my phone off. That's a law in class. It should be a law when I narrate PowerPoints. Okay, back to the presentation. So the king meets with the members of the Third Estate, a la the National Assembly, on the night of August 4th. And the king and the nobility agree to a couple things. They agree to give up their hunting rights, they agree to give up their manorial dues, and they agree to give up all vestiges of that old feudal system that remain in France. This is supposed to appease the Third Estate. Unfortunately, it's too little, too late. By August 26th, only not even 2 weeks later, the National Assembly has written a Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which we read in class, so you're somewhat familiar with that. Not much longer after that, in the beginning of September, the National Assembly began to plan its new government. Now, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, as I'm sure you recall, kind of outlawed the principles or ideas upon which this government was going to be based. But after it was issued, it came time to really figure out logistically how the government would function. The National Assembly wanted to have a king with limited power and a one-house legislative body. But as you know, because we already talked about it, that legislative body is not going to accurately represent all classes from all different socioeconomic groups of the population. The National Assembly's constitution ruled France from 1789 to 1791. Now, this constitution sought not only to reorganize the government, it also sought to change the culture of France. It was decided that if the country was really supposed to depart from its old feudal and aristocratic regime, things had to be completely reorganized. The slate had to be wiped clean. So the National Assembly issued a couple of kind of radical reforms. They abolished all towns and reorganized land into departments. That is because towns were originally based upon feudal manors. So they get rid of all the towns. Now this, of course, is disorienting to people. People have to get used to new names, new nomenclature, but it is all done in the effort to get rid of that old feudal system. Citizens could only be addressed by the title citizen or citizeness. Only active citizens could vote, men who owned land or who were renting land. And of course, as we've talked about, labor guilds were abolished. Now, we talked about the Bastille, so we're going to move forward a little bit. So how does this Constitution pan out? Well, it's an improvement in the sense that the aristocracy is no longer ruling France, but it doesn't work out too well, as I've said many times, for the lower classes. A group of men in the National Assembly really felt that the government under the National Assembly was not radical enough. It wasn't revolutionary enough. They believed that if France was going to truly be successful in its revolution, it had to spread the voice of revolution throughout the world. And it had to cater more to the lower classes. Now, this particular group of people took the form of the Jacobins, or the Girondists, but we're going to call them Jacobins. They wanted to completely restructure the government under the National Assembly. And this is one of the reasons why the French Revolution is so complicated. Under the American Revolution, our founding fathers really had a very clear and cohesive view of what kind of government they wanted to set up. They had a unified vision. They were able to compromise and agree on a unified plan. But the leaders of the French Revolution really don't have that same sense of unity, which is why the revolution splinters off into so many different directions. So, just as the National Assembly broke away from the Estates General, the Jacobins decide that they're going to form their own government called the National Convention and break away from the National Assembly. The National Convention is comprised of the Jacobins, the people who thought that the Assembly was not radical enough. And they wanted to address specifically the needs of the peasants, problems of inflation, unemployment, food scarcity, and unequal land distribution. The National Convention decided to develop its own constitution. One of the first things that they did was to abolish the monarchy. Again, they don't want any remnants of that old government to exist at all in France. They annexed Belgium and Nice, and they put the king and his family on trial, just like regular common people. And this is pretty radical because the king had not been put on trial before. First, actually, the royal family was imprisoned, and then it was put on trial. People in the streets of Paris were rioting on a daily basis. There was a lot of violence. The revolution had taken on like sort of a hysterical form. Now, another thing that we should mention at this point, I'm not sure actually if I have this. I don't in the presentation. France's neighbors saw all of this chaos as an opportunity. All of the countries surrounding France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they all decided that if France was experiencing turmoil, it was the perfect opportunity to try and attack and seize French lands. So while France is experiencing this incredible period of chaos and revolution internally, it simultaneously has to defend its external borders. Now you can imagine how crazy and hairy that made running a government to govern a revolution internally, but also have to fight all these marauding invaders on the perimeter. So when the National Convention put Louis XVI and his family on trial, they tried them for the crime of treason. On January 15, 1792, they were unanimously found guilty and they were executed. Actually, it wasn't unanimous. It was a majority of by one vote. If one person had voted a different way, the king and his family would not have been executed. But by one vote, it passed and the king and his family died. Now, members of the National Convention knew that this was a really risky thing to do. And it's risky for a number of reasons. One is because if their plan for revolution doesn't work out, they can never bring the king back because he'll be dead. Two is if the revolution fails, all other monarchs around Europe are going to want to descend upon France and punish the revolutionaries for executing the king, a member of a noble family. The third reason that it's so dangerous is because the king had a number of relatives who were installed in thrones around Europe or were married to people on thrones around Europe. And if the revolution failed and they needed to find a new monarch for France, probably the European country who had the strongest voice and the closest genetic relationship to the king would come in and fill that spot. So it was very important to the National Convention that they establish a successful government and that they make sure that no monarchy in any form ever came back to France. I should also mention that all those members of the aristocracy who fled France were horrified that the king was executed. And they too were sort of waiting in the wings for this revolution to fail so that they could go back in and facilitate a reinstallation of a monarch and help that person govern. So they're sort of also waiting on the borders for the for the revolution to fail. Now, because the stakes were so high and France was in such a state of chaos, the National Convention decided that it had to declare basically a state of emergency. It was determined that for a period of 1 year, the National Convention would be ruled by a committee of people called the Committee of Public Safety. Their goal was specifically to rid France of all invaders, all foreign invaders, and all enemies of the revolution. Now, this Committee of Public Safety was led by a very famous man named Maximilien Robespierre. You can see his name right up here in the top of the slide. Who would be an enemy of the revolution? Anyone from a foreign country who sought to quell the revolution or stop it. An enemy of the revolution could also be a member of the aristocracy or another person associated with a member of the aristocracy. The Committee of Public Safety ran the revolution from 1793 to 1794. And as I said, its goal was to rid France of all enemies. Well, how is it going to do that? By executing them. The Committee of Public Safety orchestrated something, a movement, I guess you could call it, called the Reign of Terror. And for 1 year, the Reign of Terror executed, often without trial, any person who was thought to pose a threat to the revolution. Now, that could be very obviously a member of the nobility who was still living in France, or it could be, a cook who worked for a member of the nobility, or a seamstress who worked for a member of the nobility. A lot of people were put to death who really did not pose any threat to the revolution whatsoever. This idea of sweeping cultural changes throughout France persisted and kind of hit a zenith, a high point during the reign of the Committee of Public Safety. I mentioned before that citizens of France had to address each other by the term citizen or citizeness, and that was to make sure that there was no socioeconomic or class-related distinction between individuals. They got rid of the traditional calendar that the rest of Western Europe followed and came up with their own new calendar. And the first year on this new calendar, year 1, was 1792, when the National Convention took power. The Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was seized and converted from a Catholic church to something called the Temple of Reason. And with that emphasis on reason, you can see that influence of the ideas of the Enlightenment. Instead of a Christian religion, Robespierre said that the people of France should follow something called the cult of the Supreme Being, which was sort of a nondescript faith dedicated to some kind of an unspecific higher power. Basically, it was religious freedom. Also, under the Committee of Public Safety and the National Convention, France amassed an enormous, enormous army. Huge, largest standing army in Europe. By 1794, the French army consisted of 1,169,000 men. It wasn't just the largest army in Europe at that time, it was the largest standing army in European history ever. Under the Committee of Public Safety, a new school system was started in France, and they also abolished abolished slavery in all French colonies. Now let's go back to the Reign of Terror for just a few minutes. We've got some pictures here, I believe. This is a guillotine. This up here is a link to a movie that has a pretty good guillotine scene in it. It's like a 2-hour movie, so I'll just show you the clip in class the next time we meet, because it'll take you a very long time to find just the right scene, and you won't know which one it is. This was a method of execution that was developed by a physician, and it was supposed to be swift, efficient, and painless. Now, the science behind it postulated that this slanted blade could deliver one swift blow to a person, cutting off their head, decapitating them. This was supposed to be a vast improvement over the former forms of execution, which were decapitation by hatchet or sword, or hanging. Hanging, it takes a couple seconds to die, and if you get a great executioner who hits you with one swift blow with a really sharp axe, you die very quickly. If you get somebody who's not very skilled, they might hit you in the back, might hit you in an arm, might hit you in the middle of your head. It might take a couple whacks before they actually kill you. And that could, of course, be very traumatic. So the guillotine was supposed to be a much more humane way of executing someone. During the Reign of Terror, approximately 40,000 people were executed, accused of being an enemy of the state. Approximately 8% of these people belonged to the nobility. 14% were members of the bourgeoisie, 6% were clergy, and 70% were peasants. So essentially, the French were accidentally executing members of the very class that the revolution was striving to protect. It's a little bit ironic. These executions typically occurred in public squares and took on kind of an entertainment value. It became really a form of blood sport. People would gather in the public square at whatever time the executions for the day were set. There were chairs set up. People would sell snacks, and they would watch the executions and cheer. Now, not all people during the Reign of Terror were killed by the guillotine. Some people were actually drowned or hanged. In the city of Nantes, about 2,000 people were put on barges or boats and deliberately drowned. So I guess those who died by guillotine had it easy by comparison. It was thought that once Robespierre really felt, he was the guy who orchestrated this whole thing, that once France had been cleansed of the aristocracy and all counter-revolutionaries, the Republic of Virtue would commence and France would be this great, peaceful, wonderful country. Well, all this violence in the beginning has a lot of momentum, but after about a year, it sort of peters out. People start to get really sick of it. In 1794, members of the National Convention decided that Robespierre had gone a little too far with his executions. So they decided that it was time to get rid of him. So on July 28, 1794, Robespierre himself dies by guillotine. Now, after such a heightened state of conflict, the pendulum always swings the other way. Once Robespierre was killed, the National Convention was once again in charge, and a period called the Thermidorian Reaction began. And this was a short-lived period of time where things calmed down a little bit in France. Not much, but a little bit. Churches reopened, and the National Convention organized a new government, which it called the Directory. So it wrote its own new constitution. The Directory had, it was headed up by a directory or a council of 5 men. Underneath that was a council of elders consisting of 250 men, and then a council of 500 men. So there were essentially 2 chambers or a bicameral house in this directory. It functioned in kind of an unusual way. The members of the council of 500 were supposed to handle legislation, research things, make recommendations. Then they were supposed to give those recommendations to the council of elders, who would either accept or reject them. Items that were accepted were then to be presented to members of the directory, and those 5 men would then decide if something should actually become a law or a tax, or they would make decisions for the country. Now, of course, as you might guess, only people who qualified to vote could be elected to the Council of Elders and the Council of 500, which meant, of course, that no one in that class of peasants and very few people in the skilled labor class could actually be part of it. So this government really was going to be run by members of the wealthy bourgeoisie. The Directory rules France from 1795 to 1799. It's not terribly successful, but it does have one amazing accomplishment. I'm using my son's computer. Sorry about those little pop-ups. The first ever free election is held under the Directory in 1797. A number of candidates run. They're all constitutional monarchists. And the man who is elected promises to start a constitutional monarchy. Now, a number of people ran. However, the one who ended up winning happened to be Louis XVI's brother. He was waiting in the wings, living in the Italian city of Verona during the Revolution, waiting for his chance to come reclaim the throne. He was a member of the nobility that fled when violence gripped the country. And as members of the nobility did, he was just waiting for his chance to return. So in 1797, Louis XVIII returns to Paris and he's supposed to be the first ever elected official, elected ruler of France. However, this doesn't last very long, because in 1799, the Directory is overthrown very suddenly by a extremely popular and successful and very short military general named Napoleon Bonaparte. I'm sure you've all heard of Napoleon. He's very, very famous. Slide 110 shows an extremely famous picture of him. He's looking very regal and powerful and like a military giant on his horse. He was actually only about 5'4", which is just a little bit taller than I am. So he was kind of a smaller man, especially to be a military hero. So he got together with some friends and staged a coup d'etat in 1799 and actually took over the government of France. He claimed that he was going to be an enlightened ruler. He formed a new government called the Consulate. And before he did this, he got permission from the Council of 500 and the Council of Elders. Now, they didn't really have a choice to say no, so it was sort of a situation where he made them an offer that they couldn't refuse. So he gets permission from the previous legislator in France. He overthrows Louis XVIII, and he declares himself in 1802 consul for life. He starts out in 1799 by creating this government called the Consulate. Then a few years later says that he's going to be consul for life, and in 1804 he crowns himself dictator. Well, he declares himself dictator. He has the Pope come to France to crown him emperor. And the story goes that actually, let me show you this picture. This is a picture of Napoleon's wife, Josephine, being crowned Empress of France. Now, this is Napoleon right here. This is the Pope. So the story goes that when it was Napoleon's turn to be crowned, he was the one kneeling, and the Pope was standing here. And the Pope started to lower that crown onto Napoleon's head. And just as it was about to hit his head, Napoleon reached up and grabbed the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head, thereby insinuating that although he wanted the Pope, aka the Church and God, to lend legitimacy to his reign, he was really the person who was in charge. Then when he crowns his wife Josephine, by the way, they made her look much younger in this picture than she actually was. When his wife Josephine was crowned Empress of France, he didn't ask the Pope to do it. He did it himself, flagrantly stating by this gesture that he was above the authority of the Catholic Church, and thereby above the authority of God. So we're going to talk briefly about Napoleon's reign. Let me go down a little bit further. Do we want to look at this? I think we'll talk about domestic policy first. So while Napoleon rules, he is ruling as a quote-unquote enlightened dictator. He does a lot of really good things for this country. For the past 20 years, France has been just riddled with conflict and violence. And what the French people really want is some relief. And Napoleon does provide that. He starts a Bank of France and stabilizes the economy. This means that people have more steady employment, they have more money in their pocket, they have more food on their table. He creates a new legal system called the Napoleonic Code. This might sound a little nutty, but prior to Napoleon's reign, there were over 1,300 different towns in France and 1,300 different codes of law in France, which meant that things were a little chaotic as you went from one town in France to another. There were a number of codes of law, about 7, but the most important was the one that acknowledged the equality of citizens before the law and the right of individuals, the rights of individuals before the law. And it also provided for religious toleration. So that was kind of a big deal for France. Remember that prior to the Revolution, France did not have religious toleration. He created a very efficient bureaucratic government where promotion was based on merit, not lineage or inheritance. And of course, that's significant because that upends that whole aristocratic system of privilege. He fought wars against Austria, Great Britain, Prussia, and Russia. He was extremely successful on the battlefield. And under him, life in France was pretty, well, I don't want to say it was quiet. It definitely settled down a little bit. Under his reign, he created 3,263 nobles in a period of 6 years. All of them got their position, their elevated position in society as military officers. Only a few of them came from pre-revolutionary positions of privilege. While he did grant freedom of religion, he did not grant freedom of the press. Napoleon shut down 63 of France's 70 newspapers and was he had very tight control over what was printed about not only his government, but France as a country and its colonies in general. He placed a tremendous amount of emphasis on empire building. So you can take a look here. This is a really good map. Here you have France. This is the French Empire. So France owns its own country. It owns Belgium and the Netherlands. It owns parts of northern Italy and sections of middle Italy. So this is what he actually conquered. Other lands he controlled. So the lands in light blue, like Spain, the Confederation of the Rhine, which is modern Germany, and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which is where Poland is located, these lands were controlled by France, which means that he had family members placed on the thrones to rule them as puppets. Then he formed formal alliances with other countries like Austria, Prussia, Norway, and Denmark. So why did Napoleon think that he needed all of these allies? Because he hated Great Britain. He wanted to make sure that he could defeat Great Britain when the time came. All of this acquisition of land and allies and favoritism in other countries proved very lucrative for France because the economy, as I said, improved tremendously. However, it also leads to Napoleon's downfall. How and when does he fall? Now, it looks like I spelled Trafalgar wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's right. I'll have to look that one up. Okay. He decided in 1805 that the time was right to finally challenge Great Britain. So the French Navy engaged the British Navy in the Battle of Trafalgar. It was a naval battle, obviously. The two superpowers, were vying for domination of the seas or worldwide naval supremacy. Napoleon asked his allies to join his continental system as part of his crusade to defeat Great Britain, and he asked his allies to unilaterally boycott trade with Great Britain, but they didn't really like this idea. He lost the Battle of Trafalgar, which gave Great Britain control of the seas and established them in a dominant position. So that was the first major blow for Napoleon. The second is that he decides to invade Russia. Now let's go back to that map. Here's France. Russia's really far away. And Russia is a massive country, and it gets very, very cold in Russia. In 1812, he marches 600,000 French troops to the border of Russia. They invade Russia. They cross the border with the plan of living off the land. So their plan is to basically come to one town after the next, take all the food, take the harvest, take whatever they need, and move on until they finally defeat the Russian army. Well, they're not prepared for the climate in Russia or the terrain. The Russian army knows that all that it has to do is to draw them into its interior. So as the seasons change and winter approaches, the Russian army retreats. And as it retreats, it burns every town that it comes across. So as the French army invades Russia, they come across town after town that has been burned to the ground. So there are no supplies for them. There's no food. They keep being lured deeper and deeper into the interior of Russia, and pretty soon the winter hits. The French army has no idea how to survive in these kind of circumstances. Less than a year later, in January of 1813, the Great Retreat occurs, when the French army decides that it's going to turn around and run back to Poland. Out of the 600,000 soldiers that marched into Russia, only 40,000 made it back to Poland. That means that 560,000 men died. France did not gain any territory whatsoever. So at this point, members of the government, the people in France, are a little fed up with Napoleon and his desire for conquest. Had he stopped with these territorial expansions, had he not tried to engage Great Britain, tried to get all of his allies to boycott Great Britain, and then invaded Russia, he probably could have ruled France for a pretty long time. But that's not what he decided to do. So by 1814, the government of France, members of the then ruling new aristocracy, decide that it's time to get rid of Napoleon. He's captured and sent to exile on the island of Elba, which is this little tiny blue dot right here, just between Corsica and and Italy. He's not there for very long. Pretty soon he escapes back onto the mainland of Europe, and he makes his way all the way up here to Northern Europe, where he gathers men who used to be his followers. He gathers troops, and he decides that he is going to take over France again and rule one more time. This, however, in 1850 is when and where he's defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. This time, instead of exiling Napoleon to a small island off the coast of Europe, they sent him to an island all the way off the coast of Africa called St. Helena, and he lives there until he dies. Now, when Napoleon is sent into exile for the second time, Napoleon the 18th comes back to rule again. He is the brother of Louis the 17th, and he is installed as a constitutional monarch. So that is the tale in a nutshell of the French Revolution. I just gave you a very brief glimpse. We skimmed the surface, as we typically do, going over just the major events. The revolution really lasts from 1789, I guess you could say, until Napoleon falls from power the second time in 1815. The country starts with a monarchy. The revolution begins with a monarchy, and the revolution ends with a monarchy in power. Whether or not you think it was successful is really up to how you interpret it. So before you determine whether or not it's successful, you have to ask yourself, what's the criteria for success? Did they get rid of the old institutions of feudalism and the old monarchy and the lack of a legislative body and a constitution? Yes, they did. But they certainly didn't end up with a democracy. So hopefully that short PowerPoint presentation will help you as you approach your French Revolution essay. Please email any questions that you have to me, and I look forward to seeing you in class next Thursday.